It's being recorded now. So hi everyone, my name is Eric Chen and chair of APA Division 49 Diversity Committee. I would like to welcome you all to this diversity presentation. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and it is about 50 minutes long. So you will have some time before your next appointment or meeting. And here I would like to say a few words to introduce our speaker. Let me admit those four. Thank you. Michele Ribeiro is a staff psychologist at Oregon State University's Counseling Center. Nationally, she serves as a co-chair of Diversity Training and Community Change Subcommittee for the Council Diversity Workshop Group as part of the Council of the Representatives for APA. Her recently co-edited book is titled Examining Social Identities and Diversity Issues in Group Therapy. She is the recipient of 2020 Award for Outstanding Professional Contribution to Diversity in Group Psychology or Group Psychotherapy. On behalf of the Diversity Committee and as a former Oregonian, I'm delighted that Michele is here to give this presentation. Welcome, Michele.
It's really an honor to be asked, Eric, so thank you so much. And I have some of my favorite people on here, and so it feels like we're just sitting around the dinner table and having a nice conversation. So it's really great to be with all of you today. We don't have a lot of time, and I probably, like true to my nature, probably am giving you too much. So let's just dive in. I want to say that I'm a learner. That's one of my strengths is I'm always in the process of learning, and so I don't know everything there is to know, and some of you might know more in this area. And how I normally like to do it is more of a workshop format where we are more interactive, but I know that because it's being recorded, it's really a presentation, so I'm just going to be covering a lot of information. But I want to recognize that this work is best done in a process kind of affective, experiential learning way. And so keep that in mind, because this is not my typical way of doing workshops or presentations, because it's not as, the mind is connected to the body, and when we try to disconnect them, we don't learn in the most meaningful ways. And part of transformational learning is to have a more affective experience. So I apologize in advance, because I'm just gonna be hopefully exciting your brain, but try to stay connected to the body while I'm going through these slides, because that's ultimately what we have to do in this work. So can everybody see my slides? Yes? Okay, great. So I just wanted to put a shout out for my colleagues, Joshua Gross and Marseille Turner, who the College Counselor's Guide to Group Psychotherapy also has a lot of chapters on diversity and social identities. And so I want to put a shout out for that, even though it's not in the title, that thread runs through the whole book and the issue of power differentials. And then, as Eric said, the Examining Social Identities and Diversity Issues in Group kind of looks at the many different ways that our social identities intersect with each other, and has a variety of different settings. So I recommend that book as well. So let's see. I want to start first. I'm in Corvallis, Oregon, which is located on the traditional territory of the Chepenafu, or the Marys River Band of the Kalapua. And just to honor indigenous lands, that after the Kalapua Treaty, which was the Treaty of Dayton in 1855, the Kalapua people were forcibly removed to what are now the Grand Ronde and Siletz reservations, and are now members of the Confederate Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. I think it's really important, and there's a movement to acknowledge traditional lands that we have stolen and that we locate ourselves on. And so I've given you the link. Many of you probably already know this, but I've given you the link, and I recommend that whenever you do any larger presentations, I do it when I start my classes, to acknowledge that, because it's a part of it's a part of the context, but we don't always acknowledge it. And yet what we know is that things are right in front of us and we don't see them. And so we want to be able to make things more part of our conversations. So I wanted to start just with a really good, I've appreciated this article. It's a critical conceptual framework for combating white supremacy and psychological practice. And this is a chart of the racial affect. I wanted to highlight that we've moved from the early, from the 80s to the 90s of a foundational multicultural approach to now a white supremacy or anti-racism approach. And so I just highlighted a few things from the racial affect, and this comes from Granza, Gonzalez, and Spanierman out of the Counseling Psychologist, that we as counseling psychologists, and I would say clinical psychologist researchers, we need to engage ethical questions about the therapist's role as advocate for racial consciousness raising and racial affect exploration with white clients who may not present with issues and or seek therapy for issues related to race. And this is something I'm sure all of us have been kind of struggling with at some point. Like a client will come in with anxiety or depression, and they'll say some maybe stereotypes or racially charged topics or statements, and we've been trained to kind of be person-centered, to be supportive, to be non-judgmental, to really hold the client. What the field is pushing us towards is not just to be advocates or allies for students of color, but to also recognize that we have an important role in our white students. And so there's some articles coming out about the ethical nature of when, and always there's certainly some debate of when is a time you could do it, and when would be not the best time. But I think that's something we're going to be grappling with, and that's certainly where the profession is taking us. And then I wanted to highlight just a few more. You can read these. So white supremacy, including white racial affect, are core issues for white clients. So we need to, again, and I know many of you have started some anti-racism groups, affinity groups for white students, as well as support groups for students of color. So I want to preface that I know not everybody that's attending this workshop is white identified. And so I want to recognize that there's lots of research on identity theory for people of color as well. But because my area of emphasis for about the past 10 to 15 years has been white consciousness and whiteness, I'm going to be focusing a lot on, and because I identify as white, a lot on the role of getting more conscious and recognizing the racism that is in myself as a white person, and to be able to encourage my other colleagues who are white to be able to recognize that owning up to our racism is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And I want to stay away from that binary. But I do want to recognize that it's an important step to recognize that if we've grown up in this country, we have racism in us. It's inevitable. So anyways, I just wanted to highlight this critical conceptual framework because I really think there's a lot of merit. And there's an allyship one as well, which has some controversy around that word. They've started using accomplice because there seems to be more of an active oriented state than just being an ally and calling yourself an ally, that there really needs to be an action. So some of the premises of what I do, my work around, is that we live in a racist society. And that means that we're firmly rooted in systems of racism and white supremacy. That white people benefit from these systems and receive unearned privileges that allow them to remain in control of resources and create policies, rules, and regulations that govern the body's behaviors, practices, and creative expression of people of color and all racial and ethnic groups whose knowledges, values, cultural practices, and ways of life are not in alignment with whiteness and white people. Racism and other systems of oppression harm all members of society in different ways. Race is a social construct, and we will not opt out of conversations about racism, sexism, classism, or any ism. So if we start with that premise, then we're going to be willing to have more and more conversations. And if you've read any of Robin DiAngelo's work or Tema Okun's work on white supremacy culture, you will know that, that there are many different affective things that happen to white people when we start doing this work. I feel like I've missed a slide, but maybe I haven't. Let me just go back real quick. No, I haven't. Okay, sorry. I should have printed them out. I'm back at work for the first time today. So I want to highlight another theoretical framework, and that's the Task Force on Revisioning the Multicultural Guidelines for the 21st Century. And this is just the ecological framework that comes from that article. And this is Ehlers Klaus and Gargi's work. They were on the task force. And so as you're seeing, it's a little small, but you're seeing that the client and the clinician are interacting each other, the student and the educator. So if you're a teacher or professor, the research participant and the researcher, and the consulting, the consultant. So these are just a few of the roles that we as psychologists take on, but that there's an interaction that is constantly happening, both in that interpersonal lens, and then you'll see these other layers, both of the domestic and the international and the larger societal context that has to also do with human rights. And you'll see in the outer one, there's a fluidity. There's both this resilience and this trauma that can happen equally and differently depending on the positionality that you hold in society. So if you wanted to actually get a copy of the manuscript, then you're welcome to go to that link. I wanted to highlight just there's 10 features, but my 9 showed up as it skipped the 9. That identity and self-definition are fluid and they're complex. So we need to be understanding that language is constantly changing, that how people identify, and the more rigid we are as therapists, the more we're going to be problematic for our clients. The next one is beliefs that influence our perception, and clinicians, practitioners need to move past categorical assumptions and biases. Language and communication vary across people and cultures. Social and physical environments impact the lives of all clients. Historical and current experiences with power, privilege, and oppression need to be addressed as part of our role to promote justice. Culturally adaptive, flexible interventions and advocacy within and across systems are necessary in our work. There are varied ways of working within an international context, and culturally sensitive adaptations need to be practiced. Developmental stages and life transitions intersect with a larger biosocial cultural context. Culturally appropriate and informed psychological practices need to be conducted across all domains of the profession, and a strengths-based approach is necessary to build resilience and minimize trauma within a socio-cultural context. Beverly Tatum speaks to this work being in the context of a commitment to a just society that requires 2 tasks. One is the abandonment of individual racism, so not to get caught up in whether I'm a racist or I'm not a racist, but there's also needs to be the recognition of an opposition to institutional and cultural racism. I want to highlight, there's going to be a few words that I'm going to highlight in terms of definitions. I'm going to read each of these definitions. The other ones I won't read as much, but I'm going to share those words because they're important in this work. So white supremacy. This kind of came on the scene, I would think, in non-mainstream articles for a long time, years ago. But in our more APA that are not specific to different cultural groups, it's come in the context more and more. And it's really important to name white supremacy because in our minds we think of the Ku Klux Klan, and that's how it originally started. But if we understand it as a cultural, economic, and political system that sustains white people's dominance, that's my dominance, that's many of your dominance, over virtually all sectors of society, and are reproduced through everyday dynamics in a wide variety of institutional and social settings, and is a global problem of epic proportions. The next I wanted to say, and this is, I want to give a shout out to some folks at the University of Florida, Dr. Mosley and her grad student Paris. They offered the Black Survival and Wellness course over this summer. It was phenomenal. I highly recommend. And so the term anti-Blackness has surfaced in our work in the literature. And there's a two-part formation that both strips Blackness of value, dehumanizes, and systematically marginalizes Black people. This form of anti-Blackness is overt racism. Beneath this anti-Black racism is the covert structural and systemic racism which predetermines the socioeconomic status of Blacks in this country and is held in place by anti-Black policies, institutions, and ideologies. I wanted to share, and this is, we're going to talk a little bit in a few minutes on intersectionality. I want to share this, if I can get out of this. This short video, here's how the Merriam-Webster dictionary is erasing Black Latinos or Latinx. Let's watch.
Most important things we need to consider when we talk about Latinidad is how we are personally racialized. My Latinidad is not the first thing that enters the room. My Blackness is. Hi, my name is Melania Luisa Malte. This is a word on why Afro-Latinx should be added to the dictionary. Dicen que soy Latina until I start talking about colorism, until I check them on erasure, until I choose to speak on my own behalf, until I remind them my Afro comes before Latina. I am a poet and a storyteller, and I write about my experiences as a Black Latina. My parents are from the Dominican Republic. Afro-Latina means you're a descendant, so it means you have roots in Africa, right? Because you're a descendant of African ancestors, and that you also, because of geographical location, because of our history, you also have roots in Latin America. I was coming up with a poem about mostly my own identity, because I had been calling myself Afro-Latina for some time, and I was like, okay, well, let me see how I can kind of help people understand what it means to be Afro-Latina. And so when I started writing the poem, I was like, well, let me do some research on what the textbook definition of Afro-Latina is. And I found that there really wasn't one because it wasn't even in the dictionary. And so I was kind of in like a moment of rage, and I was just like, oh, I'm going to show them. And I was just like typing on my keyboard. I was like, Afro-Latina is this, and like, look how she's erased. And I was like, merengue, bachata, salsa, rumba, tango, samba, name a beat her hips haven't formed, and twerked into baile, into ritmo, into música, you know. And I kind of got overwhelmed with it because I was thinking, like, there's so much of African culture within Latinidad, yet Black people are never centered. Within the conversation of how do we get Afro-Latina in the dictionary is to say, hey, this is not okay. Latinidad has never made me feel seen. Latinidad has never really made room for me. And so here I am creating a petition to help not only raise awareness, but to also acknowledge that my experience within Latinidad has not been so great. One of the things that I wanted to address, and I addressed a lot in my poem and in the petition, is how much white Latinidad protects white supremacy. Merriam-Webster, however, does not consider the term Afro-Latina a word. To them, America's most trusted dictionary, Latin American people of African ancestry do not exist. It is merely hearsay. What I was most surprised about was that when I did research on looking up Latina, I saw that the gender-neutral term Latinx was added. And Yet in the same year, I was petitioning for Afro-Latina and Afro-Latinx to be added, and it hasn't still been added. I feel like all of the dictionaries should, if they have Latinx, and if they have Latina, they should have Afro-Latina, because I feel like it's a part of the conversation. It shouldn't just be one narrative of the conversation. And that's really where my issue lies within Latinidad, is that it's always been one narrative. I think it would be, for me, would mean a step in the right direction if we could actually get Afro-Latinx in the dictionary. If we're not honest the way the little things affect us, how can we really be honest about the way those in power who create systems that constantly derail the livelihoods of Black folks and Indigenous folks? How can we truly have change if we're not even dealing with the small microaggressions that make us feel invisible?
So I wanted to share that, let me see if I can go back to my PowerPoint. Can you see my PowerPoint again?
Yes.
Yes, it's, okay, great. So when we go back, this elevates white supremacy, and who gets to decide what is in the most common thing we use, which is a dictionary. And then the piece around anti-Blackness. And so what does anti-Blackness look like? What does it mean? So I wanted just to share that video because it's really powerful to see how who holds power decides what gets in the written word, what gets defined, what becomes part of our culture. This was something that recently came through my email. This is our current president calling for patriotic education to defend American history from the left. So here it says, President Trump escalated his attacks on left-wing demonstrators and far-left mobs on Thursday, portraying himself as a defender of American heritage against revolutionary fanatics and arguing for a new pro-American curriculum in the nation's schools. This is really, really scary. It's happening. It's saying that we need to stop. There was also, I didn't pull it, but there was also a new article that was saying that President Trump will stop funding any organizations that use the word white supremacy, that uses certain terminology, and that we need to go back and not fall into this left-wing ideology that's not true. This is happening today. This was September 17th that this was posted in both the Washington Post and the New York Times. So again, I'm not going to go through all these definitions, but these are really important in our work as psychologists. The issue of power, who holds power, and recognizing how do we utilize the power that we have, privileges, social identities, dominant group identity, subordinate marginalized group identity. Socialization, again, how we are socialized really impacts how we see the world. What lens do we approach things with? Erasure, and you saw that in the video just a few minutes ago, of how cultures, people, and aspects of people's lives are erased from our knowledge. They are proven as they don't exist. Collusion, how do we, and this is really about a lot of white people, myself included, have sometimes said, I don't know what to say. When we don't say anything, that is colluding with the system. So even if we're afraid we're not going to say it right, and that is definitely part of the problem with white supremacy, is we feel like we need to be right all of the time. But if we fear that it's not going to come out well, then we don't say anything at all. And that is problematic. The last definition is on intersectionality. And Kimberle Crenshaw coined this in 1989 from a lot of actually Black feminist writers from the 60s and 70s. But intersectionality is really, really important in our work today, and it has to do with interlocking systems of oppression. And it's a way of thinking about identity and its relationship to power. So those are definitions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time kind kind of going over them, but to keep in mind as we move forward in this work. This is going to look at Tema Akuns. So there's two different ways. The latter can feel a little ableist, and so I'm also giving a spiral. But what I want to highlight is the latter is Tema Akun's work on white supremacy culture. And Dr. Janet Helms looks at white racial identity. Now there's many different identity development models, and they all start in a way of color blindness or thinking we are all the same. Depending on the racial identity of the person, for people of color, they're going to go through a slightly different one than white people. I highlighted, because my talk is more on white supremacy and trying to dismantle it, I'm going to highlight these are the different statuses that we will go through as a white person in a white supremacist society. The first one is I'm normal. Again, on the left is Tema Akun's work, and on the right is Dr. Janet Helms. And Janet Helms names it as this contact status. And it's important to know that this is not a linear process, even though we're going to be moving up linearly. And according to the research, it says that you really don't skip a step, that it is linear in terms of moving up, but it's non-linear in terms of moving down. And this was really important for me, because I thought, oh, as I get more and more aware of things, that I'm not going to go back down to a lower sense of racial identity development. Not true. The more I realize how embedded white supremacy is in our culture, the more I find myself wrestling with all these different feelings of resistance, of like, no, I don't believe that, or I didn't do that, and so it's really, really deep work that we have to be doing. So in the I'm normal phase, it's also known as the innocence. I'm not going to go through all of these just because of time, but it's we don't see ourselves as white, or we assume racial differences are unimportant. We're naive about the connection of power to race. We see all issues of race as individual. As we move up, the next phase is what are you, or disintegration. This is known as first contact. So we start having first contacts with people of color. We notice they are not like us. And it can happen as early as the age of 3. So for people that say, oh, we don't have to worry about it until later, when we start having these conversations in high school or college, it's too late. The socialization process has already caused us to think racist. It has already started us thinking about anti-Blackness. And so the earlier people can start having conversations, reading books with young children to have these conversations, so we can undo the racism that has embedded in our society, the better. So again, you begin to notice your own prejudices or those of your family members, and you can read more of those. I'm just going to highlight a few. The next is to be like me, and that in Janet Helms is this reintegration. In this stage, sure, Eric, do you know how to get rid of that?
May I ask you all to mute yourself so that Michelle could speak clearly? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much. In this stage, we want to be seen as an individual. We begin to sense white privilege with little or no awareness yet of power. We can feel apologetic, guilty, or fearful towards people of color. We see racism as a problem between individuals. We're not yet aware of the power of racism as a system of oppression. The next is denial and defensiveness, and Janet Helms names it as pseudo-independence. In this stage, we are forced to see ourselves as part of the dominant group. We blame people of color for creating their problems. We may deny any privilege or power that we have as members of the white group. We believe people of color aren't trying hard enough, so a lot of stereotypes. Again, this denial that I'm bad, or something that I'm doing is wrong. The next stage in Tema Akun's is guilt and shame. And for Janet Helms, it's immersion and immersion are different parts of the same phase. In this stage, we really feel and think that racism is a very big problem and that we are part of that problem. We understand at some level that we are racist. We feel guilt and shame, often deeply, and we either feel extremely responsible or we deny any responsibility. The next is taking responsibility and self-righteousness, and that's still in the immersion stage. We see ourselves as part of the white group. We understand and begin to take responsibility for our power and privilege, and we're comfortable with separation. We see challenges as teachers. We may value self-reflection. So we're starting to wake up and be able to say, something's not right here, and that I play a role in this as well. Collective action, and I'm going to put, I start to open up autonomy, which is Dr. Helms's final stage. In this stage, we participate in individual and collective action to address racism on the personal, institutional, and cultural levels. We work to make strategic changes in organizations and communities. We're thoughtful about building out alliances with people of color and white anti-racist activists, seeking structural change to address institutional racism rather than just solely focusing on the interpersonal or the individual racism that occurs. And the last part of the ladder for Okun is community of love and resistance. Again, that would fall under the autonomy of Dr. Helms. This is for consistently organizing and building a community that has the power to heal the remnants of racism, internalized racist oppression, and internalized white supremacy. We're constructing organizations and communities that can help us think critically and develop an analysis and an understanding of the community, the country, and the world. Again, I want to stress that it's very dangerous once you start doing this work to think that you've arrived and that you don't have to continue to do the work. There's so many layers, and it's been really humbling for me as I do this work and I start noticing like, this resistance comes up and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I haven't worked through this resistance. Yeah, it's lifelong work because the powers, white supremacy powers, people who hold the institutional power, even though I'm a part of that, works very, very hard for you to want to hold on to it and for you to somehow create or make rules and policies around maintaining it. So it's very, very embedded, and we have to constantly be staying in collaboration and working in community with other people. There's a 6-stage model for increasing multicultural sensitivity. I wanted to highlight that along with Tema Okun's and Dr. Helms's model, that we go through, again, as a therapist, of a sense of denial. We defend against difference and perceived threats to the centrality of our worldview. So some of us early on might have been asked to change how we do therapy. And we're going to see this more and more in terms of our therapeutic training that we've been trained in. We've been trained in by predominantly, many of us, not all of us, but many of us by white cisgender male therapists and researchers. And what does that mean in terms of understanding our psychology? Minimization can happen. We want to minimize that. Cultural differences are there. We want to avoid, we might want to collude. So they really intersect or interface with the Okun and Helms work that I just highlighted. Then we move through an acceptance stage where we begin to shift away from our kind of Eurocentrism. We start to adapt to differences. And then there's this sense of integration. And again, I want to say this is not linear as well. It's linear in terms of we move through it in that upward phase, but just because we move and we understand things and we're integrated doesn't mean we don't have a reaction around something at a later point when we're exposed to a new way of understanding our theories. I want to highlight Dr. Helms's racial interaction theory. There's 3 types that may occur between leaders and members in therapy, and they have particular relevance in therapy groups. So this comes from McRae's work as well. There's the parallel where both individuals, so the client and the therapist, or the therapist and the clients in the group, are at similar racial identity statuses. And this can feel more harmonious There's race-based communications. The counselor and client will either address or avoid racial discussions. And there's nothing wrong with a parallel. If you're at a higher stage of identity development or understanding of social identities and how power and privilege plays out, that would be more ideal. But even if everybody is kind of at a lower stage and the therapist is at a lower stage, it can feel very harmonious, like there's really no problems in the group. And oftentimes I notice that when I'm with all white students at the university I work in my group, I'm less likely to bring up issues of white racial identity. And so I have to question, like, why is that? Why don't I bring it up in the same way that I bring it up when I have students of color in the group? And so that's a learning curve for me to say, there's something about, am I colluding? Am I falling back into that invisibility? And perpetuating that these white students don't understand the impact of their white racial identity. A progressive is when one individual of higher social power, usually the therapist, exhibits a more advanced racial identity status than the other. And this creates an interaction where race and culture may be addressed in counseling, facilitating the racial identity development for both individuals. Now, this is probably the one we want the most. We want to be more understanding of racism and sexism and all the isms. So if our client brings it in, let's say, like, I have a grad student that's struggling and she might be African-American woman in a department, and that she says, I don't know what's wrong with me, I can't do this work. It would be really important to recognize that it's not necessarily her as an individual, but it's the system that's causing her to doubt herself. So I could then bring in systems of oppression that might be impeding her ability to succeed at the university. What we don't want is a regressive, and that I can't say that can't happen, because as our literature and our research is changing, as the way people identify are changing, but it's really important for us to stay engaged in this work so we aren't too regressive. So regressive is when the counselor's racial identity status, and what I'm saying is that we do want to explore our racial identity development, but sometimes these theories have moved beyond just racial identity. And so in terms of gender, we might not understand gender fluidity as much as it's changing so much. So our trans client might inform us of new things that are happening. And that's okay initially, but as soon as you realize that you don't know as much, it would be really important for me to look into the literature, to look into the practices, so I don't stay in a regressive state. But we don't want this. We don't want our client to say, this happened to me, and I believe it was because of our race, and the therapist say, oh, well, maybe it could have been just because of you're in a very hard department. So this is really problematic. So we either want to be in progressive or parallel, but the ideal would be for us to constantly be challenging our beliefs. As group facilitators, we hold power in what is named or passed over within our spheres of influence. And so, asking yourself these questions, what awareness do we as group facilitators have of our own power, privilege, and or marginalized identities? And how do we locate people in our positionality to dismantle systems of oppression as they pervade inside and outside of our group experiences? I put therapy in parentheses because many of us, I work at a college counseling center, and I'm always needing to pay attention to, in my staff meetings or in different work groups on my campus, of how to stay engaged in dismantling and recognizing systems of oppression. So all groups are a microcosm comprised of individuals, each with the unique combinations of identities, experiences, and knowledge. So as such, group leaders, self-awareness is foundational in creating a healthy group climate. Again, we need to attend to issues of power, privilege, and oppression, along with various isms, sexism, racism, ableism, ageism, sizeism, etc. And we need to bring these stereotypes, biases, and assumptions into our groups to process them and to work through them. And even when we work to minimize our own biases and assumptions, we are still not exempt from perpetuating or even introducing stereotypical elements that could affect group dynamics. And I want to just emphasize that we can never guarantee a totally safe space. We have the power to create an environment that fosters courage for people to share what is troubling them, and then maximizing the therapeutic value. Again, group therapists must be able to have self-awareness of their own intersection identities, where they hold power and privilege, biases, identifying destructive forces that impede on group processes, and how to navigate reactions and build empathy in others' perspectives to understanding and connection. This is just highlighting Singh and colleagues' work on the multicultural and social justice competency principles for group workers. And again, to attend to also to acculturation levels, racial cultural identity, and multiple intersecting identities. I wanted to, whoops. Share this as an example as we move into this next stage. And this is going to be Jamia Wilson on intersectionality.
I'm Jamia Wilson, Executive Director of Women Action and the Media. Race and gender, race and disability, race and class. Intersectionality is something that I think about every day because I'm living it. And I also think about what it means to show up in the world in my specific body with my specific experience and background. I am African American. I'm also straight. I am able-bodied except for the fact that I was born with a visual impairment. So I walk around with a disability that sometimes people can't see. I was raised in an upper middle class background, so I have class privilege. All of those things play into power, privilege, and marginalization that I experience depending on those different aspects of my identity. Even though race is a social construct and we know that genetically there is no such thing as race, it's this very powerful illusion that's been perpetuated and used to kill people. It's been used to justify war. It's been used to enslave people. It's been used to force people into indentured servitude. And to disregard that history is disrespectful to all of the people who suffered and fought for me to be able to live closer to freedom today. When I am in feminist spaces, and sometimes I might be told that it's divisive for me to bring up race, that we need to focus on the issue at hand, which is gender. Or it might come up in a space where we're doing racial justice work, and I might be told by another person of color, well, this isn't an issue about your gender, this isn't an issue about race, and it doesn't matter what gender issue is, race has to take priority and precedence in this issue. That's impossible for me to make a prioritization of various parts of my identity that are equally integral to who I am and that are inextricably connected. We want to make sure that we're not single storying other people and that we aren't contributing to that people need to be able to show up as their whole selves, and that's better for us as a community and as a culture and a society. What I really want to ask people who ask me that question is, what part of your own internalized depression or your own addiction to the drug that is privilege makes you fear full liberation for all people? There's a problem with even seeing this as divisive. There's a problem when we're not actually understanding that the liberation of all people makes us all free. When trans women of color are free, that's bringing me close to freedom. When Syrian refugees are free, that brings me close to freedom. It's really important for us to think about that, not to think about how we protect our own privilege with a structure that doesn't even work for us, but how do we create more openness and liberation for all human beings, for all humanity.
Michelle, we have about 5 more minutes.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm not going to show undocumented while black, but that'll be something that you can look on your own. So I wanted to just highlight this this chart around looking at domination, and on top is privilege. So the idea is the more privileged identities you have, the more likely, and again, how aware you are of them, the more likely you're going to be able to either oppress or make a mark and change some of the way we create policies, practices that are more anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-discriminatory. And you'll be able to see marginalized identities. And so the more marginalized identities, the more likely you're going to be impacted. I'm not going to go too much into this, but it's really important to recognize what are the various identities. This is just another look at it. This just highlights some ways to be able to have some of these conversations in the pre-group meeting. So this comes from Karen Conamera and Ari Bentley's work. This is a way you could bring in the pre-group meeting to start having conversations around identities. And this is just a nice, it's free online to be able to understand both your identities as a therapist, but also the identities and what's salient for your group members. And just highlighting, it's really important, again, to understand that safety is experienced by people with marginalized identities different than safety could be experienced by people with privilege. So recognizing that and recognizing your own identities that hold marginalization and privilege. It's really important to recognize that this work, when we do identity work, when we do racism work, evokes trauma responses. So trauma is an emotional response to an event or experience that completely overwhelms a person's ability to cope. It's biological, it lives in our bodies, and it's evolutionary. It has an ancestral legacy. So acute trauma is one type, chronic complex trauma is another. A third is historical generational trauma. And so these are just some of the examples of historical generational trauma. And as a white person, I have historical trauma. My grandfather served in Hitler's army. So I want us to recognize that we are dehumanized as white people because of our ancestral history of oppression. And people of color are carrying this in their bodies as well. This is a nice frame by Kay Cheng Tom around how understanding the window of tolerance plays out when we start having conversations of racial anti-racism work and when guilt and shame and all of these different feelings come up. This is Tema Akun's work again, how white supremacy shows up. I just gave a few examples: power hoarding, fear of open conflict, individualism, objectivity, right to comfort, defensiveness. So recognizing when they come up in you or people that you're around so you can be aware of them, name them, and work through them. There's another document that she has that this is white supremacy culture and this is something else. So that's a really important document to know what else could be the on a continuum of behaviors we could do. This is just an example, I'm not going to have time to go through it, of just a group that I was running and just giving an example at how someone is explaining a trauma that they went through of experiencing a microaggression where her roommate called her dad asking if her dad was a terrorist, and just being completely racist in her questioning around this client's identity. This is just another example that gives reference that sometimes even though their identities might be marginalized, this is of a Black trans person, that sometimes they might want to just focus on another issue, such as a difficulty that they're having. So I just wanted to say that all people of color or people with marginalized identities don't always want to just focus on their marginalized identities. And so as a therapist, you want to recognize that that's a part of the equation, but it might not be the whole equation. So that's just an example of where that happened, and the group realized that they were projecting their marginalization as the core issue, and it wasn't for this client. again, recognizing biases about group work and trying to not play into that, but being aware of how they can show up. The key to our work is really practicing cultural humility, recognizing if somebody says, hey, that was racist or I experienced that as harmful, that we apologize and we don't try to understand, you know, I didn't mean to do that, or kind of explain what our purpose was. So there's a lot of good writing out there by Robin DiAngelo. Lots of different authors are bringing this to our forefront. And I just wanted to give some credits to the different references that I pulled from. So I'll stop there. I know I went through quickly, but this will be available for you. And really, my hope was to, I'll stop sharing screen for a minute. My hope was to introduce the topic and some of the theories that are out there today in the literature. So how am I doing, Eric? 10 minutes.
150, exactly. So I just sent you all a link through chat. If you want to get a copy of Michelle's own presentation, I assume Michelle, you'll be willing to share that presentation with us. And then we will also have this recording made available through the YouTube channel as well. So I think for those of you who have a few minutes to spare, and if you want to raise some questions, feel free to do so. Any questions for Michelle?
Or comments? Share anything that's come up in your work related to this, your growth related to this too?
Did you mean in the chat or interpersonally?
Yeah.
Hi, Michelle. It's
Hi,
nice.
Go ahead.
I do have a curiosity. I have a client who, she's a white woman who has a lot of trauma in her background, and she's become very, very involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm interested in the sort of white to white calling each other out, and the vehemence with which she does that really alienates her. It's not a positive interaction for her in her growth, her personal growth process. And so I don't know. I just thought I would put that out there and
Yeah.
you had to say about it.
Yeah, so there's a few things I heard, and one is that there's lots of writings around, and Dr. Sue will talk about making the invisible visible, and so what she's wanting to do is to make the invisible visible and to call out, but there's also a lot of writing on call out culture and how that actually disconnects in terms of relationship. So what I might do is be curious, like, is her goal to be in relationship with other people? The other thing that comes up for me is this othering. Like, if we see racism, if we see the problem in another, then we're actually, again, disconnecting from the racism within ourselves. And so it's really important to not, that's the thing with call out culture, if it's done in an aggressive way, it's like, you need to do the work. And, the problem is that I need to do the work too. And so how can you open up? Like what you just said felt really harmful to me. And I'm a white person. And so I'm wondering if we could talk about, or that I've done that. I do that. I sometimes say things that are harmful, or say things that are biased or stereotype or racist. So it's more around trying to be in relationship with the other person, rather than, and there's things about calling in versus calling out. But the main thing is you don't want something to be unnamed, but you want to be able to say it in a way where you're in relationship with that person too. Like what I just heard you said feels really disarming or disturbing to me. And part of why it is because I feel like I've had those thoughts, or I've said those things in the past, or haven't spoken to it. And so just to be able to help her see, is her end goal relationship? Is it to end divisiveness? And if it is, then are her actions actually leading her for more divisive interactions? So that's a short response, Pearl.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. So it's 12:54 now, and I think we all have the meetings to go next. So thank you all for joining us, and also wanted to remind you all that our next diversity presentation is scheduled in a few weeks. I think it is October 9th, on Friday from 12 o'clock to 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So feel free to go to the website I just shared with you to RSVP so you could attend our next presentation. So thank you, Michelle, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us.
Can I say one more thing, Eric? I just want to say when you're doing anti-racism work is just to be aware of the trauma reactions in you. So defensiveness, guilt, fear, and to really, I use mindfulness. I'm constantly aware of where my breath is in sessions or in meetings. So it's really important to regulate yourself. So you can keep your head above the water because you're needing to regulate other people too if you're leading a group. But I just wanted to say that the trauma is not just in the client, that you've embodied the trauma too. Like there's dehumanization that happens to all of us. And so really learning how to regulate yourself and take care of yourself when you're doing anti-racism work, because your body will be dysregulated a lot, and you have to be able to come back into that window of tolerance to stay engaged in the work. So sorry, I just wanted to state that too if I didn't emphasize it enough. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Eric, so much, and Division 49.
Bye, have a good day. Bye.
Bye.